Okay. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all again. We're very excited to welcome our guest, Clarke Tucker, who is a state senator for Arkansas and also a graduate from Harvard and got his JD from University of Arkansas. So we're very excited to have you here. I'm sure we have questions for you. But if you just wanted to kind of introduce yourself, Chris, if you had anything to add, let me know. But yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, we got our last student joining us.
Yeah. There you go.
Chris, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was trying to wait for Sedalia to get on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
There we go. So I've known Clarke for way too many years. Clarke and I were in school together in high school at the best high school in the state. I don't think anyone's arguing with
America.
that.
In America.
Clarke, I apologize. You're right. In America, Little Rock Central. We were on the debate team together, and I believe, Clarke, I don't want to hold you down, but I think you were state champ 2 of the 3 years you served on debate, or anyway, we were on the debate team together, and Clarke was really good. Let's put it that way. Clarke has served.
That's yeah. Sorry, my connection is spotty, but yeah.
Okay, so it was to
my connection was bouncing in and out, so I didn't hear you.
You're good.
So one was like the rookie, one was the novice or like the rookie level, but yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So 2 out of 3 years. So really, really good. Clarke has served both in the House and the Senate, and I'm not. Tristan did the rest of the good work, so I'm not going to go any deeper. So Clarke, take it away, man.
Well, it's very nice to meet everybody, and it's amazing that we can all gather in this way in this day and age. But so I want this to be informal. So anytime you have any questions about what we're talking about, please chime in. But also, I'd be happy to answer any questions about more generally about the practice of law. I've been in private practice for about 15 years. It's all civil work. I haven't done really any criminal work, except for a couple, pro bono appointee cases. And I'd also be happy to answer any questions about the legislature and the legislative process. So anytime y'all have any questions about that, please chime in. Chris and Tristan had asked me to talk about, really kind of the legal side of really, communications in a healthcare setting. So that's what I'm planning to address. And so, first of all, really the cornerstone of any sort of communication in a healthcare setting is privacy and confidentiality. And that exists in multiple ways. Both statutorily and in other ways. The reason I thought I would start just by talking about the rationale for confidentiality being a cornerstone, and the reason is because you want your healthcare providers to be able to treat whatever your underlying issue is, and that the only way they're going to be able to do that effectively and be put in the best position to treat you is if they know everything that's going on with you. And if you're worried about them just going down the street and telling Johnny or Janie or whoever about what you came into their office to talk to them about, then you're not going to be totally honest with them. And that's the same really rationale for a whole lot of confidential relationships. Confidentiality with your lawyer. Speaking as a lawyer, I can only handle a case if my client is going to tell me all the facts, good, bad, or ugly. And if I don't know those facts, I'm not going to be as good of a lawyer for them. Same for, a pastor's privilege, or whatever the privilege may be. And when I use that term privilege, that's actually so I'll transition now. What y'all are primarily familiar with and what you've heard about is HIPAA, which is a law created by statute, passed by Congress to protect the confidentiality and privacy of health-related information. So that's one mechanism for protecting that. And then another is that term privilege that I've used, which is actually a state that law varies on a state-by-state basis. And there are exceptions to both HIPAA and health information that you provide through privileged communications. So a privileged communication, the term privilege only applies to communications. So, there are going to be things in your healthcare file that weren't communicated. And so that's why it's in a little bit of a different category. If they take your blood pressure, for example, and your blood pressure is 160 over 110, and, you're in a real hyper state with bad blood pressure, that's not something you communicate to your healthcare provider. So that's going to be something that's covered only by HIPAA, because that's healthcare information that the provider has by virtue of treating you. And then what you actually say to your healthcare providers is covered by HIPAA through statute, but it's also covered by this privilege that I'm talking about, which is a little bit different. But there's obviously a ton of overlap there. So tell me what you all know about. Have you studied that significantly, or do you want a little more kind of overview about HIPAA? I don't want to talk about things that you've already studied or know about.
So that is something we've studied, but yes, so you have questions. Yeah, Beth.
Yeah, I was going to say that we touched on that a little bit, like in ethics and stuff, in one of the chapters. It's an interesting thing to have, though. I know I talked a little bit to my dad about this, and he said a lot of it is really based a lot on privacy. So, like, what does it look like with HIPAA with adults versus children and adolescents?
There's one primary difference that so far as I'm aware of, and that is that with children are entitled to the same level of privacy and confidentiality as adults, except there's got to be a decision maker who is in on that information. So, most of the time that's going to be a parent. And so all of the child's healthcare information can be shared with a parent or whoever the guardian, legal guardian may be. Mm-hmm. And then, once you turn 18, it's your decision whether you're going to share that information with anybody or not. And, like a child, even as an adult, you can designate people to have access to your healthcare information in the same way. Like every time I sign up at a new healthcare provider, for whatever reason, they always list who's your emergency contact. And so, I always list my wife, and that's a little bit different than what I'm talking about, because that's really to contact that person only in case of emergency. But, they also have other waivers or disclosures where I could sign a form to have my wife be authorized to access all of my healthcare information, for example.
I know,
Did you have another question?
Yes, I was going to say I'm familiar with like adults that are under guardianship. Do they like have the same type of rights as a child, or more of an adult?
So, in that circumstance where the adult has a guardian, it would be parallel to a child, where the guardian has access to all the same healthcare information that a parent does in a child context.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, Mr. Tucker.
All makes sense. Yeah, I'm sorry. My connection is cutting in and out. Was somebody saying something?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Alexis, yeah, okay, go ahead, yeah.
Okay, so you talked about the HIPAA and the privileged communication. Does privileged communication come into play in counseling, or is that something like just in the legal, when you're in like legal cases, legal battles? Like, how does privileged communication?
It absolutely comes. Yeah, it absolutely comes into play in counseling as well. In fact, it's the privilege is almost even more applicable to counseling than
Well, what's the
HIPAA.
difference between privileged communication versus confidentiality then? Can you explain that again?
Yeah, but basically, if it's a privileged communication, that's what guarantees confidentiality.
Okay.
They're almost the same thing. If it's privileged, that means it has to be confidential.
Okay.
And one other point is the patient or the client is the one that owns the privilege. So, if I'm in counseling and I tell my counselor X, Y, and Z, my counselor can't go tell anybody X, Y, and Z, but I can go tell anybody I want X, Y, and Z. The counselor is the one who's bound by the privilege. And I can also waive the privilege anytime I want. I can authorize my counselor to tell anybody, what I told them, her or him. But yeah, it's as the patient or the client, I'm the one who owns the privilege, and there are some exceptions, but by and large, when I tell a counselor something, the counselor's bound by law not to disclose that to anybody. And that's, really the cornerstone of communicating with someone on a confidential basis, as a counselor, as a doctor, as a lawyer, as a pastor. And so that's why I'm one reason why I'm sort of drawing a distinction. Like for HIPAA, for example, let's say I had to go to the ER for some reason and I was unconscious, and a nurse took my blood pressure, and I had bad blood pressure, like I said, 160 over 110. Well, they transfer me to another room. Well, that nurse needs to know what my blood pressure is before they operate on me, or whatever the case may be. And so they're talking about all my health information constantly with each other in order to provide me the best treatment possible. And that's all permissible under the HIPAA umbrella, if that makes sense. But when there's really no reason for your counselor to ever share anything that you tell that person, with one major exception that we'll talk about, or I guess two major exceptions that we'll talk about. But it's not like you tell your counselor, "Hey, I'm really struggling with anxiety." There's no reason for your counselor to go tell a nurse, unless they're prescribing you medication, which they do in consultation with you, and that's another topic we'll talk about with informed consent. But as a counselor, there's really no need, by and large. There's always exceptions, but by and large, there's really no need as a counselor to go communicate with someone else in order to provide better treatment about what someone told you. That makes sense. The two big exceptions that we talk about for you're not allowed to disclose anything. Sorry, Beth. So those are the question from Beth is, when waiving consent, must there be an informed consent document? So you don't really waive consent, you waive confidentiality. Am I frozen? Yeah, okay. You don't really waive consent, you waive confidentiality. Informed consent is really kind of another topic, which just means that the healthcare provider has to communicate with the patient in a way where the patient understands what services the healthcare provider is going to provide, and the patient has to understand what those services are before they can agree to have the services provided to them. So surgery is an obvious example. I need to know what the risks and the benefits are of surgery before I agree to have a general anesthesia and have my body sliced open to engage in some medical procedure. So really informed consent is just about the patient understanding what's going to be happening to them, what the pros and cons of the medication are, the MRI, the surgery, whatever the service is, the patient has to understand that. So you don't really waive that. What a patient can waive is confidentiality. And so I think part of your question is, does that have to be in writing? It should be. I mean, that's your best practice, for sure. And if I'm a counselor and I'm going to be talking about something, that a patient shared with me, I'm going to make sure 100% of the time that I have that in writing, and even a text message or an email would be better than nothing on that front. I mean, a form that you have the patient fill out would be best. And to circle back, for them to fully understand what they're waiving. So that would be informed consent on their part, what they're waiving. That would be really the best practice, is to have a form where they understand what they're waiving, and then you have a written record of it. So in case it ever came back on you, you can say, oh no, look, here it is. Here's the informed consent. Does that make sense?
I will add that, sometimes places have different documentation, and you can like get authorization to disclose certain types of information. So like maybe you just want to know if the person is attending counseling and that's all the information you want, you can designate that. But if you need like a whole treatment summary and care plan, you can also get a consent for that. So you can also like limit like on your documentation how much information should be shared.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important for the documentation.
Yeah, that's right. And so, I mean, really, yeah, that's why every hospital or clinic or counselor that you ever go to, you have to sign about 5 things before they'll even treat you. And a lot of it is covered by HIPAA, but they're just, using a belt and suspenders approach and making sure they have their rear ends covered. Because like, for example, sharing your information with other healthcare providers, that's in HIPAA. So they don't need you to sign off on that. But I promise 99% of the forms you've signed when you go to the hospital have that listed in there, that they can share your information with other healthcare providers in order to treat you. Something else that's covered in HIPAA that is also in all the forms I sign is that they can share your information with your insurance carrier to get coverage for whatever services they're going to provide, and not just with their unfortunate reality is not just with your insurance carrier, but also with the debt collector if you don't pay your copay or co-insurance or whatever the case might be. So there's some examples like that. Still is the best practice to have in your form to make sure that you're just covered safely from that standpoint. Does that make sense? All right, so there's two, as I said, two major exceptions.
Ashley had a
really,
question.
not-
Sorry, it's hard to
Go ahead.
interrupt. I think Ashley had a question.
I was just going to ask, Tristan, you had just said that you can designate what information you want released or shared. Do kids and teenagers have that same right, or is that just strictly adults?
Well, I think it would be the same situation. Like the parents would be the ones giving the consent to release the information. So that would be dependent on them. If I'm
It would
correct.
be similar to what I said before. Like the information can go to the parents, but other than that, the kids' rights are the same as anybody else's.
Mm-hmm.
And what Tristan said is accurate. We presume that minors, the law, obviously some kids are pretty talented,
Mhm.
but the law presumes that if you're under 18, you can't make legal decisions for yourself. So if you're under 18, you can't give, from a legal standpoint, you cannot give informed consent. Your parent or guardian has to do that. So, any other questions about that? Okay, so two major exceptions. One is as a counselor. So this first one is really for counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists only, and it's where someone that you're treating has told you that they may harm another person. And so when that happens, you have a duty not, so your duty is always to your patient. That's where all of this comes from. Confidentiality, everything. Your duty is always to your patient. But when your patient starts talking about the fact that they're going to hurt somebody else, then you have a duty not just to your patient, but also to that person. And this is the information that you're allowed to share is very limited. But you have a duty at that point in most states to warn the person who your patient is talking about harming. Again, it varies a little bit by state, but you can warn the police, you can warn the potential victim, or other steps to protect the person who's being threatened. The reason this came about is because there's a famous case in California in the early 70s where there was a young guy who was, obsessed with a girl who did not return his affections, and he told his counselor, of his plan to kill this girl, and eventually he did kill her. And so her family, obviously that's totally tragic, and so her family sued him and the university where they were in school. He actually had told the police about it beforehand. So when this law didn't exist at the time, so he actually broke the law to tell the police about it. But still, not enough was done in order to. She was never personally warned, or her family was not personally warned, and then she ended up, losing her life, and her family sued the university where the counselor worked, and where the university police and where the counselor worked, and where they were in school. And it created this exception that really every state has created, pretty much every state has created at this point. So if someone expresses a desire or intent or a plan to harm another person, then at that point your duty is not only to your patient, but it's also to the person that they're threatening.
You said pretty much every state. I'm curious as to which states don't have that.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Off the top of my head. I would have to look that up.
That's fine. I was just curious.
So the other major exception is if you're if you have reason to suspect that a child is being neglected or abused in some way, or maltreated in some way, then you have an obligation to report that. And so this is not just for, so the first one that we talked about is really for like counselors, psychiatrists, psychologists only, LCSWs, that category of work, of healthcare. Mandated reporting for suspected child abuse applies to a whole lot of other kinds of people. It applies to basically everyone whose job it is to interact with children other than their own. So, I can kind of give you a list, but every kind of healthcare provider, every kind of teacher or childcare worker, prosecuting attorneys,
I just
Come on,
looked up some information that's kind of troubling. It says that 22 states have mandatory duty to warn statutes, but a second group is a may warn jurisdiction, which warnings about serious threats are permissive but not required. And Arkansas is included in that list. So
so
best practice warn.
there you go. So in Arkansas was on the May list, Tristan?
Yeah, I was on the list of the may warn.
So there's just an example of how one word can make a huge difference in a law. Shall or may is one of the biggest ones. So, shall warn, you have an obligation. May, you can if you want to, but you don't have to. A huge difference between those two things.
But it is in our ethics code, so.
Yeah, which is another category. So my advice would be to go ahead and do it. I
Yeah,
know
mean,
for
sorry.
no, go ahead.
I have a bad habit of jumping in. So you may not face like legal challenges, but you could get your license revoked if it were reported to the board.
That's
So,
right. Yeah, that's right.
Mhm.
And you could always be sued.
Mhm.
That's another place where confidentiality and privilege is waived. If someone sues you, then they've waived their privilege at that point, because you got to be able to defend yourself.
Mhm.
But obviously, in this circumstance, it's not your clients; it's someone else who was threatened by your client. So, yeah, my advice would be to go if you legitimately feel that your client is threatening or may harm someone. But that's really it. Aside from that, and the other child abuse thing that we're, just getting started talking about. These are two pretty narrow exceptions, which is good. We want to keep the exceptions in this context as narrow as possible for the reason that I mentioned at the beginning, which is you want your clients and your patients to feel as comfortable as talking to you as possible, and confident that what they share with you is not going to be repeated to anybody else.
Does the second exception apply to elder abuse or disabled?
It's only for kids. It's only for kids. I couldn't tell where that question came from because I froze out a little bit.
I froze out as well. Sorry.
That's okay. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about when we did our when we had our semester exam, and one of the scenarios that Tristan had was about this guy and his wife had filed for divorce, was going to file for divorce, and he had came into the counseling. He was all upset, and then he said, and she was going to get custody of 2 children, and he was telling his counselor, well, he knew what to do, and he left and stormed out, and everybody was trying to talk to him. That if he did something to his wife, he would get the kids. So that would be one of the times. I mean, you would be definitely trying to notify the wife. You would be definitely trying to notify the police, because you wouldn't know what he was planning on doing.
Right.
So
So
that was one of the scenarios she had.
Yeah, that's right. So that's really the first exception that we're talking about, where you think someone is potentially threatened, and you really have an obligation to warn that person, because your duty is to them as well as to your client.
Yeah.
And the second scenario that I'm talking about, it's only for children, and it is a little bit different because it's for suspected abuse. So, in the first example, it has to be really totally dependent on what your client tells you. In the second scenario with suspected child abuse, it could be based on anything you observe. And it could just be that if a child, your patient comes in, and your child, they have their child in the waiting room, and the child has a black eye, or fingerprints on their arm or something like that. If you see that and you suspect child abuse, you have to call the child abuse hotline. That's what you do in Arkansas, is you call the child abuse hotline. And it's actually, if you're a mandated reporter, which all of the groups I was listing earlier, anybody who interacts on a regular basis with children other than their own, social workers, every type of healthcare provider, daycare worker, teacher, prosecuting attorneys, like I said, there's a long list. People at domestic violence shelters. You're obligated by law to report it to the child abuse hotline. And if you don't, if you're on the list of mandated reporters and you suspect child abuse and you don't report it to the child abuse hotline, then you actually have committed a misdemeanor crime yourself.
So when you do call to make that report, are you obligated to reveal your identity, or is it an anonymous?
You're obligated to reveal your identity.
Because you're a mandated reporter?
Mm-hmm. So when it goes, I just happen to know about this stuff because because I just, work for the state too. But once it goes to the child abuse hotline, they either send it to one of two places, either the state police or to DHS. And if what you're calling in to report is a potential crime, really, then it goes to the state police. But if it's more along the lines of neglect, or malnutrition, that sort of thing, then it'll go to DHS and they'll do their own investigation, which may involve foster care, or something like that, although it's not a crime, if that makes sense. But when you call in, you got to disclose your identity, the identity of, and the identity of the kid that you're suspected is being abused. Yes, ma'am.
So I know that a good chunk of children do like self-harm and stuff. If I were to see a child come in with cut marks on their arm, should I report that because it wasn't necessarily child abuse from the parent, but it was from the child? But I would probably still have to report that anyways, just in case it's like the parent is cutting the child or something like that, right?
So that's always going to be a judgment call on a case-by-case basis based on all the circumstances that you're observing. But I would, err on the side of over-reporting.
Okay.
Because the worst-case scenario is if there's a kid getting abused, you saw something that made you think that was possible but didn't report it. That's bad for you and bad for the kid.
Okay.
And if you call in and they conduct their investigation and find that nothing's wrong, no harm done. So the downside of over-reporting is much lower than the downside of not reporting something that could be a serious issue. What else do we got?
Just to follow up about the anonymous reporting, because I know Tennessee, we have anonymous reporting. Since you don't remain that's not an option, do the people find out who you're filing the report on? Do they have access to that information on who submitted the report?
So here I'm talking a little bit out of turn because I don't 100% know the answer.
Okay.
But I think it largely depends on how the investigation goes. So, initially, do they know? I think not. But if the investigation progresses to where, it looks like they're either going to press charges if it's a crime, or the terminology for DHS for when an accusation has been made is whether there's a true finding or not of what's been accused. And, there's a hearing process for that. Obviously, it's not a criminal court. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. But there's a hearing process for that. And I think, just like if you're being accused of a crime, then you have sort of a right to defend yourself and know what accusations have been made against you. If it progresses to that point, I think at that point you can find out, who made the call.
Yeah. And I also just wanted to mention for everyone that when it is safe to do so, I always say that letting your client know that you have to report it. And that way you can kind of process that and walk through that together, because unless they're in it'll make the situation worse, then I would always say it's best to talk about that with your client.
How many of y'all have watched The Sopranos? So early. So do you at least kind of know what the show is about? It's y'all
gotta watch it.
I know. God.
It's a show about organized crime in New Jersey. And I'm not giving away any spoilers because literally the first scene of the entire show, it's about a guy named Tony Soprano. He walks into a psychiatrist's office. In fact, the name of the pilot episode, I think, is A Guy Walks into a Psychiatrist's Office. But it has it's like other movies or shows that you may have seen, because it covers that stuff, but it's different because it also shows him with his family. And then sort of a narrating storytelling device they have is that he gets therapy, with a psychiatrist throughout the course of the show. And that's obviously an issue, but I think in their very first conversation, and this is what Tristan is talking about, his psychiatrist, who's an actress in the show, you could just watch this scene. She handles it perfectly. He's starting to tell a story, and she's like, "Let me stop you right there. I have an obligation. If I think you're going to hurt somebody, I have an obligation to take that to the authorities." And so, anyway, it's good. It's good to communicate, just like when someone comes to your office for the first time and you have them sign the forms about who you're authorized to share their health information with. You're informing them on the front end about something, so that they have an opportunity to decide whether they're going to move forward or not. That's what informed consent is all about as well. So that sort of communication on the front end is always better, because you're giving people a chance to make their own decision about whether they want to move forward or not. So even in this
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
It sounds like, and I may have heard this before and it's just now starting to click. Harm that was done to an adult in the past does not have to be reported, but harm that might be done to them in the future does. Abuse of a child that happened in the past has to be reported. And of course, abuse that you suspect might happen to a child in the future has to be as well. So I'm thinking about Tony Soprano, and I know the premise of the show, it's just too Kane. But the crimes that he committed before he goes to counseling, if he shares with the psychiatrist, she does not have to call the authorities and say, "Hey, dude killed this guy 2
Not
years
only,
ago."
yeah, that's a good summary. And not only does she not have to call the authorities, she really can't. She would be putting her license at risk if she did, because all of that is a privileged communication. So you're right, and it could get to the point where, if someone's like a serial killer or a serial rapist or something, and they're continuing to tell their counselor about these acts that they've engaged in, to the point where the counselor thinks it's going to happen again, that may be a different story. But if what you're saying is, when I was 20, I walked in on my girlfriend and cheating on me, and I stabbed the guy, and it's that's something that was done to an adult, as you said, in the past, and that information is totally confidential, and there's nothing the counselor can do about that other than just keep it to themselves and talk to their patient about it, and that's it. Beth.
I know there's sometimes, like with Arkansas, there's this thing called 9/11, where the people that are established as mentally ill through the courts, but they have to attend counseling for like 5 years or something like that. So I guess there wouldn't really be an option for them to not continue therapy, right?
That's right. There's always an option for them as to what they tell their therapist.
For sure. I was just saying, I know you guys said that, when you inform the person of the first session that this is what's going to happen, and if they want to continue with therapy, that people on 9/11 don't have that choice.
Yeah, that's right. And the distinction that I'm drawing is, when you communicate with them on the front end, you're still giving them a choice. They may not have a choice as to whether they're going to continue therapy, but they do have a choice as to what they're going to tell you.
It's true. Yeah. Okay.
So you said that past adult crimes are not able to be reported, but past abuse, child abuse, has to be. So what if the adult is confessing to past child abuse that they did to their child, who may or may not be an adult now?
If their child is now an adult, then that remains confidential. If their child is still a minor, you have to report it. even if it's their, most child abuse is from a parent to their own child, not obviously not all, but that's going to be the most frequent way that happens. So if your patient tells you about them abusing their own child who's still a minor, that triggers the mandatory reporting. You got to call the child abuse hotline at that point.
What if it's just any random child that they abuse,
Yeah.
but you don't know who, you don't know ages?
You still got to do it. You still got to just relay the information that you have. At that point, your job at that point is to turn it over to the authorities and let them conduct their own investigation. And they may find out who the kids are, they may not, but that's on them at that point. Your job is it's not your job to be an investigator. It's just your job to tip off the authorities who can conduct their own investigation. What other questions do y'all have about it? That's it. Michelle, that's a good way to put it. Future harm to anyone has to be disclosed. Past harm to kids has to be disclosed. But it's not just, again, I'm repeating something I said earlier. The child abuse is something beyond just what's communicated to you. If you just see, as I said, see a kid in your waiting room, or if you're treating a child, and anytime you mention a grandparent, the child starts shaking. And even though they don't say anything about it, they start trembling every time you mention a particular adult. You're going to be, these are judgment calls, and you're going to be using your own judgment. But if there's anything at all that leads you to believe that a child may be being abused or neglected, or whatever the case may be, that triggers your obligation to report that to the child abuse hotline. What other questions do you have?
That gets into some potentially sticky in issues, though, which we were talking about with the past abuse that happened a long time ago, so that when it happened, they were children, now they're adults. And so you don't, I'm thinking about a client coming in maybe when they were in their 20s had an incident, and then now they're in their 50s and they're trying to work through that. Obviously a child they abused 30 years ago is no longer a child, but I'm just kind of thinking through some of the scenarios where this might be gray area, I guess, is what I'm processing out.
So, yeah. Let me see if I can look at this language, if it's on here. If you really get your mind wrapped around the purpose underlying these laws, it can help you walk through the gray area. The purpose of the first exception is, you have special access to information that could prevent future harm to someone. And you're the only one with the information. The theory on the second mandated reporting is kids are vulnerable. Minors are vulnerable. They don't know who to report to if they may not even know they're being abused. And if they do know, they may be totally controlled by their abuser, terrified, not know who to contact, whatever the case may be. None of that really applies to an adult, unless, as you mentioned earlier. But the law doesn't address elders. It only addresses kids. But you're just not in that same position of vulnerability as an adult. The law presumes that as an adult, if someone's harming you, you can tell someone about it and take care of yourself. But the law does not presume that about kids. And so the law puts the burden on adults who have access to kids, like counselors, like doctors, nurses, teachers, daycare workers. Puts the burden on them that if you see something that makes you suspicious that a child is being abused, because since the child's not in a position to tell anybody about it, you have to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering, like, I know you said that children are vulnerable. What about adults that require guardianship?
The law just doesn't address that.
Oh, wow. Okay.
This mandated reporting is only for kids. So yes, there are examples of adults who are vulnerable. You know, if it's a special needs person or they're elderly, you know, or whatever the case may be, Alzheimer's, you know, but the mandated reporting law just does not address those situations. Probably, I don't really know why. My guess is because there is a lot more gray area there, and there's a clear line on the kids. If you're under 18 years old, you know, that's a bright line.
And Beth, as Tristan has already, or President McKenzie's already pointed out, while the law has, does not speak to it, our ACA Code of Ethics absolutely does. So, you're still a mandated reporter for the purposes of your ethical code, just not the legal code according to Arkansas.
I think you are required to report that elder abuse and people with intellectual disabilities in Tennessee, though. So you just like cross the border then.
Yep.
I work for an organization that has special needs, and we are mandated reporters to report any type of an abuse or neglect that we think might be happening. We're mandated to report that.
For adults with special needs?
Yeah, my
Yes.
question for adults.
I'm sorry, I cut out for a second. For adults with special needs, you are mandated to report that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I stand corrected. Is that for elders too, or just adults with special needs?
Well, I just work with adults with special, but I also work with the children also, which we already know that's a mandated reporting. But for the adults, we also it might just be a ethics with our organization, but they tell us that we're mandated to report any type of an abuser that we think might be happening.
That may be it. It may be that. And so maybe what Tristan and Chris are talking about. I don't have all of the laws memorized, but I'm not aware of that law. But the Code of Ethics, I have very little familiarity with. So, and again, going back to something Tristan raised earlier, there's a difference between what you're required to do and what you ought to do anyway. And you need to know what the legal side is. Like, for example, you don't want to share any information that you're prohibited from sharing, because that can put you at risk for your license or legal risk or whatever the case may be, malpractice. But if it's something you're authorized to share, then your ethical code may compel you to share it.
What would you say a counselor's advice for a counselor's best way to avoid any kind of litigation?
That's a good question. It's the main thing is going to be, as a counselor, the main thing is going to be to strictly adhere to the confidentiality of your patients. except in these very limited circumstances that we're talking about. And, I treat, as I told y'all, I'm a lawyer, and I treat all of that as sacrosanct. For example, one of my wife's best friends called me about something, and she wasn't hiring me to be her lawyer, and I knew that, but she was just asking me for advice about something, and she was calling me as a friend, but the reason she was calling me is because I'm a lawyer. And so I didn't tell my wife about it, and I had no plan of doing that. And then later she was talking to my wife, and she said, I'm sure Clarke told you about this. And my wife was like, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. So that's just an example of just, she didn't hire me or pay me anything. Clearly, if someone hires you or pays you, then you have a legal relationship at that point. But even though that was the case, that where she hadn't hired me or paid me, I still treated it as though that were the case, and with total confidentiality. Obviously, any actual client that I have, that gives me confidential information, I don't tell my wife or anybody any of that. So that's the big one. You need to learn about these exceptions because they're important, for people's safety. You have duties to the public as well as to your patients. But generally speaking, it's not, I don't think it's something that you're going to be encountering on a daily basis. Your patient confidentiality is something that will be part of your life every single day as a counselor. These other examples, again, you need to know. Hopefully you don't encounter them all that often. But when you do, those alarm bells should be going off in your head. And if you have a question about whether you should disclose something, you can always talk to a lawyer about it. And you could talk because the lawyer's not allowed to tell anybody what you are telling them. And you can talk to your lawyer about your question without identifying who your patient is. So you're not really, violating their privacy at that point. You say, I have a client who's married and has 3 kids, and then just kind of generally describe the circumstance. The kid came in with bruising on the arm, and that way, should I report this? I mean, obviously that's an easy example because you should report that, but you can always, get advice from a lawyer about whether you should report something without needing to identify who you're talking about. Now you can do it in ways where, I have a client who's got 4 kids. One's in the 12th grade at Little Rock Central High. One's in the 10th grade at like you can give enough information where that person could be identified, and that's what you want to avoid in that circumstance, even if you don't give their name.
And I guess I'll just follow up with,
With a client, I'm not going to tell you who their name is. Go ahead.
oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to follow up with that is because for counselors, just what I've always been told and read is the best way to avoid anything like that is to have good rapport with your client and to have good documentation. Because if you're able to go back and see in your documentation that there is reasons for every decision that you made, even if that is disclosing information, then that'll help you in the long run if you were to have your documentation like subpoenaed or anything like that.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Yep. Because it also creates records of what your patients told you, so at that point, it's not really a he said, she said scenario because there are documents to show what happened.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you legally get out of revealing your client's details when subpoenaed?
So that's going to be another exception. It's definitely a HIPAA exception. But if you gotta, if a judge orders you to do something, well, that's up to you, really. I mean, you see, you see in the news, you could Google it. There have been times where judges subpoena like a reporter to reveal who their source is, and the reporter goes to prison, but without revealing who their source is. So you could feel that strongly about it, and if so, then God bless you. But if a judge orders you to do something, you're not going to be risking your license or committing a crime by disclosing the information at that point.
So how would you speak in a way as to where you're not able to, or you're still, I guess, keeping some realm of confidentiality, even though you had to give over documentation?
Well, typically that request is going to come after your relationship is over. That's not really going to come in a scenario where you have an ongoing relationship.
But can it?
I guess it's conceivable. I've never heard of that, but that goes back to the rule of thumb we talked about earlier. If that were the case, then you just tell your client, "Hey, look, I'm under the obligation of this subpoena. Just so you know, whatever you tell me, I'm going to have to report to the court."
I guess the only case where I can see that your client is still your client is in the case of like divorce and custody. If your notes get subpoenaed in those situations, would that be a little bit different?
So in the law, we have, I mean, it's not just in the law, it's in, but CYA, right? Cover your rear. And so, if I have a client who won't take my advice, I'll write them a letter and I say, "Here's my advice. It's up to you what you do, and I'll follow your decision as your lawyer. But if you go this way, you're going against my advice." And that way I have a written record. So if it goes bad when they make their own decision, they can't come back on.
I have a question, Mr. Tucker.
Yeah.
So how much of rights, privileged communication, just how much do inmates incarcerated, if you're working with the incarcerated population and you're a psychiatrist or therapist and within the ward, how far do privacy rights and confidentiality, how does that work?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I can give an educated guess. I think, well, here's the real answer. If you're doing that work, you will know the answer to that question before you start providing any services, because that's going to be clarified by the warden or a court or.
So is that by like a prison by prison, or is it a state by state, or is that?
That'll be a state by state. It'll be a state by state issue. And so, if you get hired to have that job, then you'll be trained by somebody, the Department of Corrections or whatever the case may be, to do that work. And when you receive that training, they will answer that question for you.
Okay.
My guess is that, they're still entitled to some privacy, but less privacy. That's my guess.
Alexis, if you will remind me on Monday, I have a forensic counseling book that I will loan you that addresses a lot of that question in there, along with some other ones that would be helpful for you as you move forward.
I will do so. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah, really good question.
And that answer probably goes for any sort of like really special scenario like that. I mean, you'll get special if you're going to be a counselor to astronauts while they go in outer space, then NASA will give you some training for that. I mean, it is a great question for sure, but just, there will be other chances to learn if you're doing something really that highly specialized to learn what the standards are for that.
It's just like if you're working with like mandated clients by the court system, there will be certain information that you're required to report back to them. But that's not going to include like everything, like everything that they're talking about. It's just going to include some certain key things that you'll know about ahead of time. So,
Even for inmates.
sorry, what'd you say, Alexis?
I said even for inmates. So I know they have, I guess, select confidentiality, but even with the sessions that you have with them, are they not still under the same premises, or
It
is
would
it
depend.
different? It would depend.
It's going to depend on, are you there as a employee of the prison? Because if you're an employee of the prison, then some of those confidentiality and privacy issues don't apply. If you are an outside contractor working specifically for, I don't know how this would work, but if they were, for that individual, separate and apart from the DOC, Department of Corrections, that may be something different. But if you're employed by the Department of Corrections, then pretty much your books are probably going to be pretty well open.
That's
So
right.
how does that work in the realm of confidentiality? Is it just a special case, just limited, or?
Yeah, it's a special case.
Okay.
Special case. And you'll know going in, like, to use a lawyer parallel of what Tristan was talking about. Sometimes if a kid is going in and out of foster care, then the kid's parents will have a lawyer. DHS has their lawyers, and the court will appoint a lawyer to represent the child themselves. And in that circumstance, that lawyer will get specific instructions from the judge and training on the front end, but before they ever talk to their client, who's the child, and the attorney-client privilege. It's really exactly what Tristan was just describing. It's different. It's the attorney doesn't say everything the child told them, but there are certain key markers that the attorney will have a list of and be trained to listen for, and they'll report those back to the court.
So in cases of kids in juvie, are their parents allowed to know what goes on in those sessions?
So there's also, like the case of privacy. And so confidentiality and privacy are a little bit different. So like I
was just saying, like, in juvie, like their confidentiality. So I know, like, they're saying with minors, you have to inform the parents, of certain things that they tell you. So it's like, is it the same thing under juvie, or are they under a different context? Or does the parents have to always be informed about every move that's being made?
There's just going to be special circumstances on that. What's the relationship with the parents? Was the kid in foster care before? Are the parents still the guardian? And all of that is going to affect the answer to your question. But just like I said in response to Alexis's question, if you're doing that work, you will know the answers to those questions before you start.
Clark, one of the things that Tristan and I were talking about before class, Tennessee passed a law a few years ago, and then Arkansas followed suit with the Medical Ethics and Diversity Act. I think you were in the House at that point. And can you talk a little bit about what that act did and how it might relate to how we as counselors care for our clients? So I know there was a lot of controversy around the act.
So the one I'm thinking of was just last year.
Right. The one that Arkansas passed it last year. They tried to pass it in 2017, a similar one in 2017, and the governor said that he wouldn't sign it.
Yeah. So I'm pulling up the language in the bill.
Sure.
What this I didn't like. I voted against it. Just full
Yes.
disclosure. This gives medical providers the right to refuse treatment to people, and it basically, if here I'm gonna pull it.
And what kind of threw me, which I was reading it, they're also like they have the right to like refuse care based on their conscience, and also they're not required to find a referral for their client,
Yep.
which is part of the code of ethics.
Right.
What was this bill or act called? What was this?
The Medical Ethics and Diversity Act.
Okay, thank you.
It's Senate Bill 289. And what Tristan said is actually, I spoke against the bill when it was on the Senate floor, and that was exactly one of the points that I made, Tristan, because that when you become a healthcare professional, you have the Hippocratic Oath, and your duty is to take care of your patients. And if you can't do it, then you send them to someone who can. And what this bill says is that if the treatment that you're providing violates your conscience, then you don't have to provide it or refer them to anybody else. And conscience is, very broadly defined.
So I know we're kind of getting off topic, but I just want to understand this. So I work in a medical office, a specialty. So are you saying that like we aren't required to send referrals over? Like, because if we can't handle it, we always send them out to like a retina specialist or so.
Only if that only applies is if the service that you're providing violates your conscience as a healthcare provider.
Okay.
If it doesn't violate your conscience, then you still have the same referral obligation.
Okay.
So Alexis, the situation that really gets talked about a lot from our side as counselors is, let's say a person has a deeply held religious belief concerning the appropriateness or sinfulness of LGBTQ individuals. If I held that belief, and y'all should know by now that I do not, but if I did, I could refuse service to somebody and then not refer because I have a deeply held personal conviction.
That makes much more sense. Okay.
That's really what this is about.
Okay.
Right.
And Chris put it in a very diplomatic way. But that's really what this is about, is an ability of people who don't approve of homosexuality being able to deny care for LGBT patients.
Mm-hmm.
But the act doesn't define it that way. It's even more broadly defined. And, the act really defines it. If just take me, for example, I have a deeply held religious belief that if someone who's a lawyer and a politician gets sick, I don't think they should get better. You pick whatever criteria you want. It's so broadly defined. It doesn't have to be an LGBT person. It could be, I'm not going to treat anybody with, blonde hair and blue eyes, or, black skin, or whatever the case may be. So anyway.
And this was passed last year.
Mm-hmm.
In Tennessee too, but before then.
Yeah.
ACA actually opposed it. Like they came out against it, and that national conference was supposed to be held in Nashville, and to like protest the law, they pulled the conference out of Nashville right very soon before it was held to happen. And so it was like a big deal for Tennessee.
Yeah. Basically, all healthcare providers oppose this legislation.
Yeah. And the reason I brought it up, Clarke, is, counselors historically, we don't do a very good job of advocating for our profession for various reasons. So I would love for you to speak to maybe how, from even the legislation side, how we as counselors could be better advocates for our clients, for legislation out there that is pro-client versus whatever
Yeah.
this was?
That was a question I wrote down.
I'm
That's a
sorry,
good-
Tristan. I apologize.
That's a really important question. So, as legislators, we deal with every issue under the sun, and it can be kind of daunting, really, because it's everything from highways, education, tax policy, agriculture, environment. I mean, just you name it, everything. And my goal as a legislator is to know more than the general public on every issue and less than the experts in that field, which I think is a pretty reasonable goal, because the reality is that the experts in the field of whatever issue I'm dealing with, they're always going to know more than I am on that issue, always. And so, if they're going to get a lot of deference from me. Not that I'm going to totally cede my decision, to them every time, but but they're going to get a lot of deference. And if a profession like counselors, for example, comes out and just overwhelmingly on one side of an issue, as a legislator, you're just going to be hard pressed to say, actually, all of you counselors out there that have received, years of training and then done years or decades or whatever the case may be of service in this field, I, John Q, politician who have spent 30 minutes on this, know more about this than all of you combined to put together. I mean, that's just, an unlikely scenario. So with something like this, with one good thing about the political process in Arkansas, at least at the state level for state lawmaking, is the general public can testify on any piece of legislation at the committee level. Not when the bill is on the floor of the Senate or the House, but in the committee, you can go sign up and testify for or against any bill. So if there were a bill like this coming through, for example, and on this one, we needed, frankly, more people to do it, but it's a complex process, and I'm not being critical, but that's why I'm glad you asked the question, Chris, because the more people know about this, the better. But when this bill is on the committee agenda, if we had a bunch of providers, including counselors and psychologists, psychiatrists, and other healthcare providers, whatever the case may be, show up and say, look, I went into this to help people, and this law does not help people. It goes totally against, what I believe as a professional and why I went into this career. And you have one person and then another and then another and then another who are all unified and singing from the same sheet of music, then that can be pretty persuasive.
So basically put as much pressure on them as possible.
Yeah. And the other thing is, if you can create an association, which I'm not sure if there is
There's an Arkansas Counseling Association.
Okay.
And here again, we need to do a better job of advocacy. And the association has talked about that need for advocacy, and a lot of it came from this bill that we're discussing right now.
Okay. Do you know if y'all have a lobbyist?
I do not right now, but I can that answer will be, I actually have my chair on speed dial, and I intend to ask him that the minute we get off here. So that's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Tennessee has like a separate organization under TCA where it's the Tennessee Counselors Licensing, which is all focused on licensing issues and legislative issues. And we have a lobbyist too. So I would think that Arkansas would have something.
So the State Board of Examiners, they used to also have a lobbying arm. That was before the State Board of Examiners came under the control of the government. Dr. Luce used to be president of the State Board of Examiners for counselors. And once it got subsumed under the larger umbrella of Arkansas, that kind of went away.
So the lobbyists, depending on the issue, serve different roles. But in this particular context, what I think the most important job of the lobbyist is really kind of facilitate communication between the members and the legislators. Because what I'm talking about, where you testify in a committee about a bill, it's hard to know when to show up.
Mhm.
And you really only know when to show up if you're down there living it. And y'all have other jobs. You can't be down there living it and know when to show up. But your lobbyist will be down there living it. And your lobbyist shouldn't be the one to testify. But the lobbyist should be the one to say, looks like this bill is going to be on the agenda at 9:30, Thursday. Time to get time to get the membership here, and that sort of thing. Or to facilitate conversations where they call somebody like me and they say, Clarke, do you have time to visit with folks from the Arkansas Counseling Association and other legislators and set those meetings up and that sort of thing. So, it depends, but I think that's one of the main jobs of a lobbyist is on something like this.
And how would you recommend people to stay up to date on pending legislation?
So there are a variety of ways. Again, the best way for you to stay up to date on pending legislation for issues that affect your profession really should be from your association. And that's another thing that your lobbyist can help you with. If you just follow the news, then you're going to get information, a lot of information about a legislative session, but it's going to be on every topic, crime, taxes, education, all the things I mentioned earlier and more. A lot of legislators have newsletters, and you can sign up for legislator newsletters, and those newsletters will include information about the session. But really the only group that's going to track legislation related to you is your own association, So that's something else that a lobbyist can help with, because the lobbyist will track all of the bills that are filed. And if the lobbyist sees something that affects your profession, he alerts your chair, and then your chair can alert the members. Now, that's in an ideal world. Some associations are bigger and better funded than others, so if it's a smaller association or a newer association and they're not totally on top of all that, it's understandable. I mean, it's a lot what I'm describing is a lot to ask of an association. But there are some associations that have thousands of members and are well funded and have their own staffs, and so that it's easier for them. But I've been on all sides of that. I've been on members of nonprofit boards with professional staffs, and then I've been on a member of a nonprofit board that has no staff, is entirely volunteer driven. It's just kind of different animals. And I don't know where your association falls on that spectrum, but it's just the more you can do, the better. But you want to be reasonable with your demands too.
Well, we have about 10 minutes left, so this is y'all's opportunity to ask any last burning questions y'all have.
I don't have a question, but I think you did great, and I appreciate the information. So thank you. It was really informative.
Good. Thank you. I appreciate it.
As a politician, do they have special privilege when it comes to their counselor notes being subpoenaed or asked for versus, let's say, just a regular person?
So there's a few different contexts for that. So one is there's no special law as far as a subpoena goes, right? Like but if you work for the government, we have in Arkansas what's called the Freedom of Information Act. And what that says is that So, you know, I work for all of you, right? If you're a taxpayer, I work for you. And as a taxpayer, you have the right to know what your tax dollars are being spent on. And so you can submit a request under the Freedom of Information Act, virtually any public entity in Arkansas, and get the documents that you're asking for. Like what if you live in what town do you live in?
I stay in Arkadelphia.
So you could literally email Arkadelphia and say, I need all of the mayor's emails for the last month, and they'd have to give them to you. So yeah.
But can they do that with I guess you're saying yes, they can't do that with counselor privilege or so. Well, there is no privilege when it comes to just because of like the information they might be telling their counselors, you know. So I wonder if they get like some type of special privilege because of that.
So I'm not totally tracking what you're saying exactly, but
well, like,
politicians-
okay, so because politicians in the nature of their work,
yeah,
and so let's say they do have therapists, but let's say a politician gets in trouble for being corrupt or whatever, and so they want to know the counseling session records. Is there like a type of protection for politicians in that sense, or are they just treated in every, like, you know, the general population?
Yeah, they have the same rights as everybody, which is that they have the right to confidentiality for with their counselor. Yeah.
But would it
No
be
special
harder
right.
to subpoena? Would it harder to like get their records or something? Okay, let's just take Hillary Clinton for example. Let's take Hillary Clinton for example. So how she was how she had got in trouble and everything. So let's say she was going to a counselor, and let's say the court had asked for her counselor records. Would there have been a way that she could have had that, you know, taken away, diminished, or it would have been only certain records would have been released instead of, you know, all of her notes, well, all her sessions in a way. I don't know if that makes sense.
There's really only three ways that her counselor would have to give up her records. One is if Hillary was making a threat against someone for another adult for future harm, or two, if Hillary was, which I, you know, don't think would ever be the case, but I'm sticking with your example. If Hillary was, you know, disclosing some sort of or raising a concern about child abuse, or if she did something to waive her privilege, that's it. Otherwise, it's protected, and it's the same for Hillary as it would be for me or you or anybody else on that front.
Thank you.
And there's a number of ways you can waive the privilege, which we, you know, sort of, we gave a few examples earlier. If I can just say in writing, I waive my privilege, or if you're my counselor and I sue you for malpractice, I've waived my privilege there too. I mean, there's multiple ways to waive the privilege, but just speaking broadly, waiving the privilege, the example where you're threatening harm against someone in the future, or that you're creating a concern about child abuse. Those are really, you know, that's about it. Otherwise, your records are safe and confidential.
Well, thank you so much. This was a great information. I learned things too, so that's always a plus. We appreciate you for taking the time out of your day, your busy day, to talk with us. Any last comments for our guest speaker?
Just,
Before we
you know,
Informative.
go ahead.
It was very informative.
Good.
Mhm.
Good. Well, thank you all. Zoom's not always easy. This is actually one of the better, like, more engaged interactive Zooms that I have had. So thank you all for being so engaged and interested in this stuff. And Tristan and Chris, thank you all for having me.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good evening. We'll
Okay.
go ahead and let you go so we could talk about class update.
Okay, sounds good.
For
Y'all have
you.
a good night.
See you, Clark. Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Alrighty, I just wanted to mention a few things before I let y'all go. Thank you for all the questions y'all asked. Some really good questions. I hope you got a lot from that. And just some reminders. If you haven't turned in your movie review paper, that it is due today. Only like you can both partners can turn it in, or you can have one. And make sure you also upload a document of like an outline of like what parts you worked on specifically, just so we can kind of go through that. Does anyone have questions about that?
Do we just email you our, I'm so sorry, Alexis.
It's okay, go ahead. We both
Is it okay to just email you what we did for our portion of the paper? Because usually if I try to re-upload, submit something in the same assignment deal, it erases what I originally sent.
Mhm.
that's fine. Yeah.
So I submitted for Beth and I submitted it through my Canvas. Does
Yeah.
she go through and submit through her Canvas? I mean, it said on there it counts for both. So
Right. Yeah. Just if you're the one uploading it for your group, just make sure you share all the comments that I make and all the feedback with your partner. Any other questions about the movie paper? Okay. And then the only other things we have is you have one more discussion post, and then after that, you'll have your final exam, which is a similar format. Well, it'll be the same format as your midterm with the multiple choice questions and then a scenario at the end. So just do the same thing, go through the ethical decision-making model. And you'll have 3 hours for that open book. And then it's not a cumulative, I don't believe. It's just chapter 7 through 13.
Oh, okay.
So, and then once y'all are done with that, then y'all are done for the class. And I really enjoyed working with all of y'all this semester. It's my first semester with Peterson State. And so I just appreciate you all for accepting me and, reaching out and doing good work. So
So
thank you.
Tristan, I have a question. Are you going to be doing more classes with us in the future?
Yes, I hope to. I'm going to take a break until I finish my dissertation, but yes.
Fair. That's totally fair.
That's what she thinks. No.
Gonna get it done really quickly. Okay. Anything else before I'll let y'all go?
Well, since I have both of you here, I just wanted to say thank you for making my first grad semester very entertaining and very smooth.
Yeah, of course. We're glad you're here.
Yeah.